President Kennedy asked me initially to serve as Secretary of the Treasury, I said absolutely not, because although I'm president of one of the largest corporations in the world and have much financial experience, I'm not qualified to be Secretary of the Treasury. And then he had instructed Sarge Shriver to say, well, if I said no to that, to insist that I be Secretary of Defense. And I said, well, no, I'm not qualified for that either. But if he will allow me to appoint the most outstanding people in the country without any regard to political affiliation, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, and with no interference from the White House, I would be the sole judge and appoint all of the senior people in defense from, I'll call it the best and the brightest, I would do it. He said yes, and he never violated that. And we had, I think, I'm boasting now, but we had, I think, the ablest group of executives in any cabinet office in the history of the Republic. Now, we made many mistakes, human beings do, but they were an extraordinarily able, dedicated group. It left me with a sense almost of fear, of concern. Fear is probably the wrong word, concern. The tremendous responsibility, the obligation to act in ways that were in the interest of the country and, in a sense, in the interest of the free world, since the U.S. Defense Department was the foundation of freedom for the free world. And that's what I felt, a tremendous sense of responsibility. And a real question, was one capable of fulfilling it? When I came to the Defense Department, I couldn't tell the difference between a nuclear weapon and a bale of hay. But President Kennedy had campaigned, and some said won the presidency, on the argument that President Eisenhower and the Republicans were so irresponsible that they left a missile gap in which the Soviet Union had many more missiles than the U.S. did. Well, it soon turned out that that information was wrong, that the Soviets, there was not a missile gap, or if it was in our favor. In any event, very quickly I had to become an expert on nuclear weapons. The doctrine of massive retaliation provided an effect that the Warsaw Pact pressure, conventional military force pressure on the West, would be met immediately by a massive all-out nuclear attack. That would have been suicide, in my opinion. So I tried to change it, or the President Kennedy, authorized me to try to change it to put less reliance on nuclear weapons. And we called it flexible response. We would respond initially with conventional weapons. It was so controversial, it took 5 years for NATO to even accept what I'm going to call a diluted version of it. They never did really give up the strategy of responding to Warsaw Pact conventional forces with nuclear weapons. That would have been suicidal then. It is still a NATO strategy. The U.S. has never stated, NATO has never stated, it would not be the first to use nuclear weapons. For NATO to be the first to use nuclear weapons against a nuclear weapon-equipped state, such as Russia is today, would be suicidal. For NATO to initiate the use of nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state is militarily unnecessary, morally, I think, unacceptable, and politically repugnant. And yet that has been and is the policy. I want to say to you, we should never, without any qualification, we should never initiate the use of nuclear weapons. Against a nuclear-equipped state, it's suicide. Against a non-nuclear state, it's militarily unnecessary, morally wrong, and politically indefensible. And I think Kennedy accepted that argument. Later, when he died, I made the same statement to Johnson. I think he accepted it. I wouldn't call the Bay of Pigs a poison gift, as some have, and nor do I blame Eisenhower. It was first place, it was a CIA program, not a Defense Department program. Second place, it was the Eisenhower administration that formulated the plan. But in the third place, it was the Kennedy administration that implemented it. We didn't have to, so we can't blame Eisenhower. It was a terrible mistake. a total failure. People have said that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the best managed foreign policy crisis or defense policy crisis of the past half century. And in one sense, I think it was, but we were lucky. You can't manage nuclear crises, and it was a nuclear crisis. Your audience may not believe this, but at the height of the crisis, on Saturday, October 27, 1962, at the end of a day during which President Kennedy and his senior military and civilian advisors had spent all day long arguing about whether we should or should not attack Cuba if Khrushchev didn't take those missiles out. And by attack, we had our forces ready to launch. The first day's air attack would have been 1,080 sorties. That's far more than we ever used against Kosovo, for example, in any day. We had 180,000 troops mobilized and at ports in the southeastern United States with the ships available to move them to Cuba. At that time, the CIA stated that we had photographs of the missiles, but they stated there were no nuclear warheads there. They said there were 20. There were there would be something on the order of 40 missiles. But they said there were 20 warheads, the first batch, coming for the missiles on a ship named the Poltava. It wasn't until 30 years later, 30 years, that we learned how wrong we were. They had 162 nuclear warheads there, about 90 tactical warheads to be used against an invasion force of the kind we had, and the other 60 or so to be used on the missiles. And on the Thursday night, which would have been October 25th, General Pliov, the Soviet commander in Cuba, had sent Malinowski, the Soviet defense minister in Moscow, a cable saying he was moving nuclear warheads closer to their delivery vehicles. Malinowski sent that into Khrushchev. Khrushchev scrawled, approved across it, and sent it back. My God, what would have happened? You call that managing a crisis? No way. We managed it in the sense that we prevented knowledge seeping out before we had developed a plan, and we weren't subject to the tremendous pressure from uninformed individuals. We took time to think through alternatives. We took a week to even formulate a proposal, which ultimately became the quarantine. And during that time, we worked almost literally 24 hours a day, examining all alternatives. And Kennedy's approach to deciding on a course of action was a very wise approach, but it wasn't a crisis that was managed because neither Khrushchev nor Kennedy was able to control all of the variables. And we came that close to nuclear war. When I say we, I mean you. The world came that close to nuclear war. I mentioned that they had 162 nuclear warheads there. Our commanders had asked Admiral Dennison, who was to be the commander, he was Sink Land, NATO's Atlantic commander, but he was also the designated commander for an attack on Cuba if we attacked. He said he had information the Soviets had tactical nuclear weapons on Cuba. We said he was crazy, President Kennedy and I, and Dennison asked for Kennedy's permission and my permission to equip our force with nuclear warheads. We said absolutely not. Now, had we carried out the invasion, which we were that close to, our force would have faced those 90-odd tactical nuclear weapons. Nobody should think that an American force could be hit with nuclear weapons without responding. Even though the force itself didn't have them, we would have launched air attacks from the U.S. against the island of Cuba. We were told 10,000 Soviet troops there. It turned out later they had 40,000. There were 150,000 heavily armed Cubans determined, in their words, to die to the death, to defend to the death. What would have happened? An absolute disaster for us, for Cuba, for the world. That's not management, that's luck to avoid that. The question of the 40 years, say from 1947 to the end of the Soviet Union, or end say 1989, that 40-year period. I don't think we yet know either the Soviet intentions or their full capability. We believed, for reasons that I can elaborate on, that they intended to constantly apply pressure to the West, including military pressure. For example, in August of 1961, they sought to take West Berlin away from NATO. They supported North Vietnam in opposition to the U.S. And at one point, the chiefs even believed it might be necessary to invade North Vietnam, in which case they said we might well be in a war with the Soviet Union. The hotline, which was installed after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was initiated by the Soviets, the hotline installed after that crisis was used for the first time in June '67. And one of the messages passed from Kosygin to Johnson was, if you want war, you'll get war. Now, this came about because of their possible intervention in the Six-Day War in the Middle East. So our belief that the Soviets intended to apply military pressure whenever they could get away with it and weaken the West as a result had some foundation. But in retrospect, I'm not certain that the Soviets intended to strike the West militarily. Now, even if they did have that intention, I'm inclined to believe we overestimated their capability, their conventional force capability. It would not have been easy with their conventional forces to defeat NATO's conventional forces, even if NATO had not used its nuclear weapons. So I think this is an important issue that history should examine today and tomorrow. When President Kennedy died, we were deeply involved in Vietnam militarily. However, one should not fail to recognize and remember that on October 2nd, 1963, a few weeks before he died, I had recommended to him and the National Security Council that we establish as our policy complete withdrawal militarily from Vietnam by December 31, 1965, in 2 years. And further, that we begin that withdrawal by taking out 1,000 troops before the end of 1963, that is to say within 90 days. It was a very, very controversial recommendation. We spent most of the day in the National Security Council debating it. At the end of the day, President Kennedy agreed with it. And to ensure that we didn't have any second thoughts, I suggested we announce it publicly that day. It would be much more difficult to walk back from a publicly announced decision than it would be from a secret decision. And he agreed to that, and it was announced. And we did withdraw the 1,000 before the end of the year. Johnson, in a way, inherited President Kennedy's policies with respect to Vietnam. I think, in effect, he was a free agent. As the war evolved, he had the freedom to proceed as he believed best. Of course, he had some degree of legacy from Kennedy, but he went far beyond the legacy. So I think he and we who were associated with him, Dean Rusk, myself, Mac Bundy, the security advisor, Walt Roskauer, all of us, I think, must assume the responsibility. And I think that Johnson should be viewed as having made the decisions based on his own analysis of what was in the interest of the country, not because he felt that he was doing what Kennedy would have insisted be done, or not that he felt there would be political penalties if he didn't pursue a Kennedy policy. But I refused to see Oliver Stone's movie on Kennedy because I was told there's a scene in that movie in which Johnson says to the 5 chiefs of staff, you give me my election and I'll give you your war, implying that they wanted the war in Vietnam and he didn't, but he had to pursue it in order to be elected. That is absolutely false. I've been asked 100 times, if President Kennedy had not been shot, would we have ultimately had 500,000 troops in Vietnam? And I refused most of the time to answer the question because it's speculation. I know what he had decided October 2nd, 1963, that we were going to plan to withdraw completely the 16,000 advisors within 2 years. But of course, events changed after that. That decision was made before President Diem was killed. It was made before, I'll call it, chaos began to develop in South Vietnam. How would Kennedy have reacted to that? I don't know. But I nonetheless have answered the question in my book, and I'll repeat it now. I do not believe he would have introduced the 500,000 troops or any substantial number of, or a substantial portion of the 500,000 had he lived. And the reason I say that is that I think he believed very strongly in the domino theory, as did we all. By the way, I think we were wrong on that. But we all believed that. President Kennedy did, President Johnson did, I did, the chiefs did, Secretary of State did, and so on. Certainly Nixon, Kissinger did. But I think Kennedy would have felt we were militarily and politically incapable of preserving the freedom of South Vietnam by our political, economic, military intervention. And therefore, even though he would have, I think, have found this contradiction between the domino theory, which meant that if we weren't there, if we didn't put in more troops, if we didn't win militarily in the South, the communists, Chinese, and Russians would sweep across East Asia and South Asia. That was the domino theory. I think he accepted that. But nonetheless, I believe he would not have put in the troops because he would have believed we couldn't win. He said before he died, this is a war that can only be won by the South Vietnamese. It cannot be won by U.S. troops. I think he believed it. He was right. And I think, therefore, that faced with this dilemma, if we withdraw or don't put in more troops, we lose East Asia and South Asia, the domino theory. But if we do put in more troops, we're going to lose it anyhow, and we're going to kill Americans. Now, faced with that dilemma, I think he would have decided not to put in more troops. Very early, relatively early, I should say, I came to the conclusion it was unlikely that the U.S. could achieve its objectives in Vietnam, i.e. avoidance of a communist takeover of South Vietnam, by military action. And in December 1965, I said in a meeting with President Johnson, Dean Rusk, Averell Harriman, and some others, I said that I didn't believe there was more than a 1 in 3 chance, or at best a 1 in 2 chance, to achieve these objectives by military action. And Johnson said, "You mean to say we've got to shift to a diplomatic course?" And I said, "Absolutely. We must put more weight on diplomacy because we can only negotiate an end. We can't achieve it by military force." Now that is on the record. Averell Harriman took notes, and those are available. So as early as December 65, long before we had 500,000 men, I was convinced you couldn't achieve the objective militarily. We went ahead pursuing a military course because we tried, quite unsuccessfully, to initiate negotiations. And I think there, with hindsight, we were very amateurish in the way we put forward the negotiating proposals, and they led nowhere. At one time, the Joint Chiefs of Staff spoke of the desirability of invading North Vietnam, in effect taking Hanoi with U.S. troops. And they were responsible enough, candid enough to say, and Mr. President, if we were to do that, we might find ourselves in war with China and Russia, and we might have to use nuclear weapons. Certainly neither Johnson nor I were prepared to accept such a risk. And that was one, not the only reason, but that was one of the major reasons why we refused permission to invade North Vietnam. I wrote in retrospect because I believed that we should try to draw lessons from what was certainly a failure. We, the U.S., clearly did not achieve our objectives in Vietnam. We failed. And I felt that we should try to understand what caused the failure and draw lessons from it so we wouldn't repeat those errors in the future. We, the U.S., had made a number of errors, and I believed that we could learn lessons from those and apply them and avoid the situation in the future. And I think we could have prevented that without ever having gone in. We missed the opportunities. So we identified a number of those opportunities, put them before the decision makers from the North Vietnamese government, both military and civilian, and spent 7 meetings examining them. And we finally concluded, both sides concluded, yes, each of us made mistakes. Each of us misjudged the motives and capabilities of the other, as well as their own capabilities. And therefore, something on the order of 3,800,000 Vietnamese, North and South, military civilian, were killed. 58,000 Americans were killed. That could have been avoided. No, I think Johnson was wrong on Vietnam. I think we were wrong on Vietnam. Vietnam was a serious mistake, but it was a mistake on both sides, and it was a function of this belief that was not limited by any means to Johnson, that the West was under tremendous threat from communist hegemonists, expansionists. And after the end of World War II, you saw the degree to which the Soviet Union took over Eastern Europe, and then you saw the extent to which they put pressure on Cuba, and they, through Cuba they were infiltrating Latin America and Africa, and you saw their support of the Chinese in Asia. So there was reason to fear what was going on, and it wasn't just Johnson. It was the American people and the West generally. It wasn't just America. It was Europe that had many of the same views. I'm not suggesting Europe supported our position in Vietnam, but they did support our view that communism was a serious threat to freedoms of the West. And as I am prepared to say now, we may have exaggerated the degree of that threat, both in its intent and in the degree to which, if that were the intent of the Soviets, we may have exaggerated the extent to which they were capable of carrying out that intent. But that's what drove us. I'm not sure I resigned. I'm not so sure. 30 years after I left the Defense Department, I don't know whether I quit or was fired. Because what happened was that Johnson and I had deep affection, real love for each other, and great respect for each other. But we were totally at odds on Vietnam. And I couldn't persuade him I was right, and he couldn't persuade me he was right.